So when you think about, I know you've been talking about AI a lot, but if you think about generative AI, I've just been gathering the metaphors that people use. When I hear them, I just jot them down. And the first two that came out could not have been more different. It was a calculator for words and nuclear energy, right? And calculator for words is like, this is something we've seen before. It's a tool. It's not that big of a deal. It's just going to allow us to do the things we already do better. Nuclear energy was like, this is a game changer. It's also full of problems. It could be an existential threat. And which one of those is right? Well, neither and both, right? They're both half wrong. They're both half right. We don't really know, but it's very useful to be able to like go back and forth between them, be like, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And so like, what's useful when? And I think a usefulness is something that's showing you something you're missing that can allow you to make a decision or take an action.
We're going through something absolutely historic.
Technologies across the board are growing exponentially.
It's a disruption that's going to completely redefine the way businesses compete.
In the next decade, we're going to lose 40% of today's Fortune 500 companies.
The exponential growth of computing is continuing.
AI is nowhere near its full potential.
Whether you like it or not, that the future cannot be stopped by anyone.
Hi there, everybody. This is Mark Verbenkoff, and welcome back to the Future Tech and Foresight podcast. This is going to be episode number 170, and today we take on a little bit more of a theoretical, or I guess you could say, sort of esoteric perspective when it comes to the singularity and the future, the exponential growth of technology as we move into the future, all these kinds of very interesting concepts, and how we as individuals and as my guest talks about as designers, both leaders but also individuals in society at large, can help to construct the future in a robust and beneficial way that kind of supports everybody in the society, rather than just as we've talked about on the podcast a couple times before, rather than just having a few heads of corporations benefit from the vast abundance that is going to be created over the next decade or two. So I'm not going to talk too much about the episode and the discussion beforehand. We do bring up a number of interesting terms that are defined by Scott Doorley, my guest today, so I want to kind of leave those out of the introduction, but we do touch on some ideas that I personally am quite familiar with, such as like speculative fiction that fits into the strategic foresight work that I've done in the past, which I've mentioned a couple times on the podcast. There's ideas of like looking at histories of the future, which is kind of a way to critically reflect on what might happen. So there's some interesting, I would say, unique ways of thinking about the future that Scott brings up and that we talk about as tools or methodologies on how to think about the future and create actions and strategies that lead us into this better, more beneficial future for all of us. It's a really interesting discussion. I haven't thought personally about design and designers as a way of co-creating or creating the future too much in the past, but I think Scott does a great job of outlining some of the key terms and methods at the beginning of the discussion, and then that kind of opens up the possibility for us to have really interesting kind of back and forth about the future that we're moving into, that has obviously been talked about on the podcast a number of times, but also bring in new ways of thinking about it, while also talking about kind of those really interesting technologies that are at the I guess you could say is one of the pillars of the future that we're going to be moving into. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to introduce the guest and let the conversation flow, because I think my introduction doesn't do justice to the interesting conversation that we have. So my guest is Scott Doorley. He is a writer, designer, and the creative director at the Stanford d.school. He has overseen everything from books to workspaces to digital products and initiatives focused on the future of learning and design, which comes into play very much during our discussion today. So he co-wrote the book Make Space, How to Set the Stage for Creative Collaboration, and is the co-author of Assembling Tomorrow, a deeply hopeful manifesto for shaping the future. He currently teaches courses in design communication, and his work has been featured in museums from San Jose to Helsinki and the New York Times. Hi there, Scott. Thank you very much for coming onto the podcast today. I think it's going to be a unique and maybe a little bit of a different conversation than all the focus on artificial intelligence that I've been doing recently. So glad to have you on.
It's good to be here, Mark. Thanks.
Yeah. So we're going to be talking a little bit, obviously about your book. We can get in that a little bit later, but we're talking about design and the future and, how to change things or move into the right direction so things don't get messed up in the future. Could you maybe bring us, maybe it doesn't have to be a full journey, but like what brought you into kind of the world of design? And I think we should also kind of define that in a bit, because I think the way that you define design and your co-author and the book is maybe a little bit different than how other people are thinking about it.
Yeah, I might actually start there and then why I kind of got interested in that, So, I work at this place called the Stanford d.school. The way we think about design here is really interesting. We was just talking to a colleague who has been doing some research about the history of design in Silicon Valley and Stanford. And it started with this idea of comprehensive design. And it was called product design. And at that time, this is back in the 50s and 60s, most design schools were calling it industrial design. And so industrial design was really focused on manufacturing and aesthetics. Product design was focused on the entire experience of using something. And so that even since then has broadened out into, experiences through services, even how you design systems. And so if you look at the student work that comes out of here, like last couple of years, grad students have produced musical instruments that teach you how to play musical instruments. They've looked at different ways to pinpoint breast cancer. They've created synthetic palm oil that's really about a systems change in not just being sustainable, but also helping the farmers that produce the goods. So in a lot of ways, it's actually moving toward the thing that you're making is not really the goal. You're making things to change things. And so the change is sort of the ultimate goal. And the way I got here was I studied film at UCLA, and I had friends who were working in design. I started getting into web design and user interface design. And as soon as I did that, I was like, I got to figure out how designers learn. Like, why do they think in this particular way? And what I mean by that is, how do you take on a challenge you've never seen before? And how do you create something? How do you work towards what the problem needs rather than sort of what you've learned to do, what your craft is? So I loved making movies, but every idea had to turn into a movie or a TV show. And so the ability to say like, well, actually what this needs is a user interface, or what this needs is a space redesign, or what this needs is a system change was just fascinating to me. And I started talking to people about that, and no one knew what I was talking about. This was probably 20 some odd years ago. And then I found folks here at Stanford here, they're like, that's what we're doing right now. We're trying to open up an institute that'll look at just that, how designers learn, how people navigate ambiguity, how people can bring things into the world that can change things down the road. And so I just happened to find them right as the D-school was starting. And I became a fellow, and then I've really stayed ever since.
Super interesting. Maybe one question going back to this, I guess you could call it like this new way of thinking about design. I mean, it's reasonably new to me as well, but so I mean, I finished my undergrad in, I want to say 2008, went traveling, did a whole bunch of cool stuff, and then went back to get my master's, I think in 2016, 17 or something like that. And when I went back into the kind of academic world, there was a lot more language and rhetoric around acting in the world rather than trying to understand it. I mean, whether it was activism or trying to change things.
Yeah.
Is that also maybe connected, like the timeline wise, about this shift about thinking about design, not just about a product or, the thing that you're producing, but it's around a system shift that's connected to this concept of design?
Very much so. I mean, as I mentioned, our program started in the early 60s, and they were thinking that way already back then. It just wasn't sort of popularized really until the early 2000s. So it was the aughts when it started coming in. So it makes sense that, by the time you arrived in the teens, it was really full swing. And I would say like probably around 2010, 2012, it really started to catch on as a different way of thinking about it. And I have to say, like, you mentioned something in there. You were like, I went to undergrad, or I graduated from undergrad in 2008. Then I did traveled and did a bunch of cool stuff. Then I went back to grad school. It's really that moment of this doing a bunch of cool stuff where I don't know what you're doing to be interested to hear, but like where our students, we require grad students who come into the program to have experience outside of the university.
Right.
And that is particularly one, they develop ways of working that they can then bring and influence other students with. So like different students have different ways of working that can all influence each other. And then two is you get to have some experiences out in the world that show you, what you need really, what it takes really to do things in the world, right?
Mm.
And I think actually one of the issues we have right now is our ability to create is actually exceeds our ability to understand the things that we create. So I'm 100% pro, academics as understanding. I think it's incredibly necessary. At the same time, if you want to turn that understanding into something that's going to have an effect on other people, you really also have to put it into use to see how it works, to understand what you need to do to make it happen. And there's no, you have to try making things to really learn that part of it.
Very, very interesting. Well, I mean, I talk a lot in real life, and the podcast for me is a bit of an experience, a practice of shutting up and letting other people speak. But you asked me a question, and I think this actually ties into what we're going to be speaking about at larger scale today. So part of the cool stuff that I did was I backpacked throughout Latin America before smartphones were around. I had to use the Lonely Planet travel guide to go around places. I did a whole bunch of cool stuff there I don't need to get into. But I also worked in Cuba for about 8 months, in Havana and then down in Guantanamo in the city, doing some interesting, intergovernmental work between Canada and Cuba and other Latin American countries. Um, and the reason I'm saying this is, like, obviously my mind expanded considerably from being in Canada my whole life and, going down to Mexico with family vacations or something like that. And this is the segue into what, we're going to be talking about a lot more. My realization or understanding about the world and what's happening, expanded at not tenfold or hundredfold, like 1,000 or 10,000 fold. And like there was I guess not a true understanding, but certainly a deeper understanding that we're living in a time where things are happening. There's a lot of changes, fascinating changes, like people's lives are getting destroyed and created kind of day in, day out. Um, I kind of set that up for you. So can you talk about, the book and like where the inspiration came from, as we were talking about before recording? Because I think it ties into these kinds of ideas.
Most definitely, and I'll build just on a couple of things that you said. You talked about even just the act of traveling in South America without a smartphone.
Yeah.
And there's something about this might be old man talk, but there's something about moving from that analog world to this digital world that we're in right now and being able to see that transition happen where you understand how fundamentally different that is. As an example, you're much more reliant on communicating with people to find your way, right? And you're in a position that has a lot more unknown, right? You have this guidebook. It might have, you go to a town, it might have 2 places you can stay, and you don't even know if they're available. And the person might have written it 2 years ago, and now they're gone. There's just a lot of ambiguity to try and figure out. Whereas when we get things in real time, that ambiguity is lessened. However, I think the time that we're in right now is probably the most ambiguous that I've lived through. And that has a lot to do with this technology that's coming toward us. There are lots of different ways I can describe this moment, but as we were writing the book, we initially set out just to say like, wow, this is a big moment. Things are changing. People who make things, which could be a designer, an entrepreneur, even a teacher or business leader, you're gonna have to think about things differently because what's coming at us is so different. This was when we were thinking about the book back in 2018. Well, it released in 2024 this year. So, in that interim 5, 6 years, a lot has happened. We no longer have to convince anyone. But we tried to dig down in the book into, well, what is really going on? Why does it feel so strange? Or why does it feel like everything's going haywire? Why does it feel the opportunities are bigger than they've ever been? And as I mentioned, there's many ways to describe it. One way we talk about it is that, the relationships that we have between ourselves, humans, technology that we're creating and nature are really shifting around. We've got ways to interact with nature that are a lot more technological. We're coding at the level of DNA. And then at the same time, the machines that we're making are doing much more human things. They're able to communicate in ways that feel very human. They're thinking, they're creative. I don't know if thinking is the right way to put it, but at least they're doing our cognitive work. And then that kind of puts pressure on us is like, well, where do we belong in this whole thing? And so I think that sort of shift between those relationships is creating a world that it's really hard to understand what's coming. And so what we need to do is figure out, well, if we're going to find opportunities here, how do we operate in this ambiguity? How do we find our way? There was an article recently talking about this is the age of intelligence that Carissa Carter, my co-author, sent me. I think in some ways it's the age of ignorance. Yes, we're building machines that can, crunch ideas more quickly, like they're of higher intelligence, but the impacts of that, how we're going to use that, that's all we don't know. There's a lot more unknown, I think. And that can feel, disconcerting, but it can also be full of opportunity if you look in the right place.
Yeah, well, I definitely want to get into those points of breakage and opportunity and some of the things that you write in the book. Very interesting. I'm often in conversations with people on the podcast, and I also think to add to this, there's a lot of people that obviously have different perspectives on what is happening and where things are going. So I think that maybe adds to the confusion of you can maybe listen to one or two people, and they have a very strong perspective. This is where we're going. This is what's happening, and then you kind of fall into that belief set because they're charismatic, they're very good speakers, and then you hear somebody else and they make good points too, and you're like, oh, well, now my little paradigm is kind of crumbling here, and now I'm actually more confused because, well, if that person's saying that, maybe there's another person, and I think that adds to a lot of confusion. And one other point, and maybe you can speak to this or you can ignore it. I think this is also a different, and I've never found the right words for it, but like a different like lifestyle for humans. I was just my grandmother's 96th birthday is today, so I phoned her up and we had a little chat about like what life was like back in the past, and she was like, well, like I grew up on a farm, we didn't have electricity, we didn't have running water. My mom the same, my grandma the same, my great grandma the same. Like it was just always the same for generation after generation. Maybe there's a war here and you have to go to a different country, but then it's the same. It's just generation after generation, there's more or less of the same sort of things. And then 100 years, it's just all this stuff has happened. One final point, I gave her the opportunity to check out my virtual reality headset 2 years ago, put it on for 5 seconds, turned it off and said, I don't want any of this. I'm happy with the way I am. So it was too much of a change, right? From going from no electricity to trying virtual reality. I've said a lot there, but please
I
comment.
mean, that's amazing. And yeah, again, I feel like your point, there's so many ways into this. And what you just said now was so full with all the things that we're talking about, all the things that I'm sort of excited about and worried about. So at the beginning, you talked about how, well, you go online or you listen to podcasts, which this is one, right? It'll give you a certain perspective. You go listen to another one, you'll get another perspective. In the back half of the book, we talk about these things we call actionables, which are ways to really figure out how to navigate when it's very unclear what's going on. And one of the things we looked into was research around the use of metaphors. And that's one of those things that you don't really think about, but all day long we're throwing metaphors at each other. It's all mental models, and this kind of is compared to that. And when you're in a situation when things are coming even faster, so you used like the dawn of electricity for your grandmother as a sort of analog for this time. We're constantly thinking that way. And a really useful tool is to just step back and be able to like watch the metaphor as if it's something to try on. I love it. I agree with you. I'll listen to one podcast, be totally bought into that perspective. Another one, be totally bought into that perspective. So when you think about, I know you've been talking about AI a lot, but if you think about generative AI, I've just been gathering the metaphors that people use. When I hear them, I just jot them down. And the first two that came out could not have been more different. It was a calculator for words and nuclear energy, right? And calculator for words is like, this is something we've seen before. It's a tool. It's not that big of a deal. It's just going to allow us to do the things we already do better. Nuclear energy was like, this is a game changer. It's also full of problems. It could be an existential threat, and which one of those is right? Well, neither and both, right? They're both half wrong. They're both half right. We don't really know, but it's very useful to be able to like go back and forth between them, be like, okay, in what ways is this like nuclear energy? Is that going to be helpful to me? There's a British statistician whose name's escaping me right now, but he had a great quote, which is, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And so like, what's useful when? And I think a usefulness is something that's showing you something you're missing that can allow you to make a decision or take an action. So you're looking for things you're missing that help inform you as to what to do next. And I think just switching metaphors or listening to how we're talking about things, it's super useful, and it's actually not that hard. You just take 1 second just to notice how you're describing it, how other people are describing it, and be open to all of it, but don't accept all of it, right? Try it on. Like, think of it as an outfit.
Very interesting. What do you make of this concept of exponential growth? Because I think this is closely tied to what we're talking about, right? If, again, to use my grandma example here, she was part of the dawn of electricity, and then it took however many more years for her to get like a car, and then so many more years for whatever other new technology. But now it's like, okay, we've got social media, we've got AI, we've got virtual reality, we've got the metaverse on its way. Like, there's I don't know if you saw the Mark Zuckerberg presentation. I think it was yesterday, where they presented Orion, which is like the newest and latest and greatest artificial reality glasses that, they're a little bit thicker than yours, but they essentially bring AR to the real world. So there's just like almost not every year, but every couple of years, there's this new big potential revolution of technology. And I think that makes it a little bit different compared to like my grandma and your grandma and everybody's grandma, where there was like one big thing every decade or two, and now it's just kind of condensed in that time frame.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think you're right. It's the exponential growth that's making that hard to even fathom as a human. The guy I work with, Eli Willery, I forget where he got this. It's not his, but he talked about how if you think about exponential growth and you think about a pond, say, that's filling with algae, on day one, it might be a quarter full. On day two, it's a half full. By day three, it's full. So like, you go from quarter full to completely full in 2 days, and your brain just can't really think that way. I'm always so interested in, again, this gets back to the metaphors, but or just the watching of how we talk about this stuff. But we started using the word emerging with tech more recently, right? This is sort of like, I started doing a little bit of research on it. It's really like 2012, it starts to get used, and then it really kind of heats up in the late teens. And why are we using emerging now? We're still just talking about new tech. Like in 2000, we would call it new tech or just tech. And now we call it emerging. And I think it's because the speed of emergence is actually as hard to deal with as the tech itself. So it's not just whatever change we're making, but the pace of that change. And I have a little acronym I use to kind of describe how that feels. When, things are coming at you faster than you can absorb, you're never up to speed. And never up to speed is NUTS, nuts, right? And so it's sort of driving us nuts. But if you think about that word, it means many things, but colloquially, it's both. I'm really excited. Like, I'm nuts about that song. I love that song. It can mean I'm excited. It's a positive thing. At the same time, it can be driving me nuts. Like, this is really just putting me off kilter. But in both cases, it's this excited mental state. And again, I think that's something, if you're, say, a business leader or anyone who has to try to shepherd people through decision-making at this time, I think it's really important. And there's a lot of studies that support this, which I'd be happy to go into. It's really important to notice that it's making you overexcited and know that whether you're overexcited in a positive way or a negative way, that is not a great place to make a decision from. So you want to like notice that excitement, step back, and then start to pursue your goal. You know?
Right. So you're saying meditation is absolutely key in the
I
in the
think it is, you know. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with Yuval Harari, but you know, his point is really like if we don't develop our brains as fast as this technology is developing, we're in trouble. And I think there's some real truth to that. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, do we wanna dip our toes into that little rabbit hole? I mean, whether we're developing our minds in some sort of, quasi spiritual practice and, the techniques that you can do, mindfulness, breath work, et cetera, or whether it's, down the Elon Musk Neuralink path, right? Because I think
Right.
those are kind of two competing narratives that are being pushed as the quote unquote solution for this time of excitement that or overstimulation that we're all experiencing.
Yeah.
I could speak a lot on it, but I want to hear your thoughts.
I think that well, actually, I would love to have a back and forth on it. I hadn't really pitted those two things against each other. I think it's a very interesting way to think about it. Um, and I think basically what that gets into is sort of like the, you know, nostalgic kind of doomsday technology approach and the techno optimism approach.
Mm,
I feel like in all cases, they kind of have an extrapolation. If you think in one direction or the other, you're kind of subscribing to a utopia on one hand with the Neuralink, say, and a dystopia on the other hand with like, if we don't go back to the way we were, we're doomed. And I think that's rarely the way things play out. You know, like we use a lot of fiction in the book, and the reason we use fiction is to basically just be able to get into the day to day of these changes and start to play with like what's going to happen. But in all cases, we're trying to like some of the stories are just the most mundane thing in the world, but it happens to exist, you know, in an era when you can resurrect a family member, you know. But it's like, okay, you've resurrected a family member. What's day-to-day life like after that? Like, what are the problems that we still have? And I think we get, and this gets into the point of like the idea of being in this sort of space of feeling like it's driving us nuts is that like when we are overexcited, we extrapolate beyond what's real and we start to make up these things and then kind of pretend as if they're real. I will say I probably, if I had to say it, I would probably fall a little bit on the Yuval Harari side of that coin, I think.
the transhumanist.
No,
Or,
facial. And the like, we really need to kind of step back and get our, you know, yeah, versus the Neuralink side. I think on the Neuralink side, it's really interesting. And, you know, I've heard his goal there. You know, I have to say, like, he's off putting to me in general, but he does some interesting things and he thinks about things occasionally in interesting ways. And his point is like, our bandwidth of communication, you know, basically through our mouths and fingers is so slow that we'll need to kind of develop some sort of way of interacting that is quicker. And I think there's probably some wisdom there too.
yeah.
But personally, and you know, I only have so many more years on the planet, you know, in terms of what I'm going to see, the way your grandmother sees things, you know, in the next 40 years, hopefully. Um, I don't know. I think I'm more in like, let's get it right with ourselves so that we can deal with things. I don't know what do you brought
Yeah,
that
I
up?
mean, I've to be perfectly blunt with you, I've been confused. I've been on the fence, shall we say, which is not a great answer, but it is the answer. When I was when I was younger, definitely this kind of techno optimist perspective, where it's like, yeah, all I need is a computer in my brain, and I'll be able to get so much more done, and I'll be able to think properly and stuff like that. And then, you go through 10 years of traveling across, a couple different continents, and you're like, wait a second, maybe there's a little bit more to this life. And, then you come out of it and you're like, well, I don't, who the hell am I? I don't really know what I understand, there's too many smart people out there and they're all saying different things. So, how can you make up your mind exactly?
I will say too, you know, they are smart and they, you know, I'm kind of mixed up in it myself too. But like there's a lot of intelligence out there, but they don't know either. You know, like really, you know, like if you hear, I think Sam Altman's a great example, here he is running OpenAI, which is kind of like the fastest growing, at least sort of splashiest example of this. He's often in interviews saying, I don't know what's gonna, you know, and that's, I think that's the part of That's the thing I appreciate about this moment. I feel like there are more people honestly saying, like, "We don't know what's gonna happen." Now, they're still running at a, 100% pace, so, you can read into that what you will, but I at least think it's a different conversation than it was, say, 15 years ago when social media was coming out.
Yeah, yeah, and maybe to kind of put a lid on this point, on this little rabbit hole that we've gone down, tangent we've gone down, is because there's so much going on, right? Nobody can truly know. There's too many variables. There's too many
Yeah.
interactions. It's kind of like nuclear physics, right? There's so many things interacting with each other. You can't truly know what the outcome is going to be unless you really control the inputs and things like that. And so far, that's not happening.
No, and I think the control, it's just hard to control. I mean, definitely we have agency, but I don't know if like control, factors in totally. It's sort of like decisions about what's coming decisions about what's coming to be kind of feel like
Yeah.
where we have some influence.
Okay. Let's bring it back to the book a little bit. So there was one point that I especially liked, or one concept, which is this breaking points. Could you describe a little bit what that is? Because I think it also goes to these practical approaches and the advice that you kind of have later on. It kind of filters into that. So please go ahead.
Yeah, the main idea, and it's funny because for us, Carissa Carter, my co-author, and myself, like it's kind of it's not a negative thing, but when you start talking about it, it feels negative at first. So the idea is that everything breaks. So if you go through history, no matter what we make, it's either going to break down. So, I have a car right now that's an 11-year-old car. I'm looking for a new car. It's literally starting to break down. It breaks because things just don't last in the world. The second law of thermodynamics and all that stuff. Yeah. And then at the same time, even if it works well, it's going to disrupt something else. So there's a really interesting, maybe I'll get into it in a second, but there are interesting versions of the internet that were coming out in the 70s or the 1970s and 80s that were like pre-internet, but there were different ways of thinking about it. And when you play those out, it's really interesting to think about what was good about that and what wasn't, even though they were sort of utopian ideals and things like that. So everything's going to break. So as you're making something, again, we're thinking about it for designers, but we think of design as so broad that this could be, you're creating a product, you're doing a startup, you're, teaching a class, whatever it is you might be doing, just to take the sort of downside into account and make it part of the design. Now, you're never going to know what all the downsides are. But the point is, if you don't take it into account, it's going to surprise you. And it's not that failure is not going to happen. Failure very definitely will happen because it happens in everything, right? I mean, you run your own business.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Every day you think about that.
Totally. And the most successful business is full of failures. You try something, it doesn't work. You invest in something and maybe you spend too much on it. You have a difficult relationship with someone you're working with. It's full of failures. So we're just trying to say, if you can be honest about that, it might allow us to get to something that feels more harmonious. Because a lot of times, because when you're trying to sell something or when you're trying to even just inspire people to work on something, leading with this is going to be great, but it's also going to screw a bunch of things up, is not the best way to recruit and sell and that kind of thing. But when you're really getting down to the nitty gritty, if you can understand where it can go wrong, you can really figure out how to make it right. And it's going to be better in the long run, no matter how you look at it, whether you're thinking about that in terms of sustainability or thinking about that in terms of profit. Like if you can anticipate the issues, you're going to do a lot better.
Mm-hmm. And so you were talking about using fiction in the book, and I think the term there is speculative fiction. For the conceptualization of these breaking points, do you recommend speculative fiction, or is that more of just a tool to help people realize, what the future might be on a kind of a larger societal scale?
Yeah, so there are lots of ways to speculate, right? We all do it all the time. And so I might just imagine that something's going to happen and then I might plan towards that. The benefit of kind of turning it into a story or kind of working out the fiction of it.
Mm-hmm.
So there are many ways to do this as well. You can literally write a story or you can create scenarios to try and figure out what might happen. Is you start to get into the details, not of what's going to happen, but what's going to happen if that happens?
Yeah.
So it's the second order effect, the third order effect. And then that really, it kind of does two things. One, it brings everything down to size, sort of like, oh yeah, that's okay, if that happened, this could happen. Maybe that's a manageable thing, or, it just kind of makes it more tangible. And then two, it allows you to really play with what you're actually trying to achieve in the world. So it's actually like an excellent way to plan. So I don't know if you have to sit down and write a short story, but I have been suggesting to people, I've been doing it myself, is, if people have a journaling habit or you have a planning habit, plan something fictional or journal about something. Well, like, I'm worried about this thing. What if that did happen? What would happen? And what if that happened? What would happen? And then you can really just start. It also allows you to like see how interconnected things are. And then it allows you to think differently about the stuff that's coming at you. You don't just see it as like, oh my God, having ChatGPT in the classroom is going to make everyone cheat, right? That's sort of the first order effect.
Yeah.
Well, okay, if everyone starts using it, well, how do we have to react to be able to put that into the class? And if we do that, well, what's that going to do to the way we grade or what we're trying to teach? And basically it allows you to get back to your motivations. Like, what are you really trying to do? Rather than just being like bombarded by all these changes and thinking, well, I better keep up. I better use this. And because when you're only working on the level of the solution, the like incorporating ChatGPT into the classroom, it's really hard to keep sight of the purpose. Like, what actually am I trying to do? Why would this be helpful in trying to do that?
Yeah, I think it's also helpful as as we talked about at the beginning part of this discussion, right? The overabundance of things coming towards us every day, whether you're on TikTok or not, right? Like we're all being bombarded. And if, maybe I've listened to too much Jordan Peterson over the years with my brother, but like if you don't have your fundamental values kind of aligned correctly, you can be swayed by any of these micro bombardments that we're being shot at essentially every single day. But if you have those, the meaning, the values, the things that you're actually like working towards, then you can kind of navigate that. And maybe this speculative fiction methodology, if you will, is useful in reconnecting with those core purposes and moving forward for whatever you're doing, classroom, business, et cetera, et cetera.
Totally, because it sort of forces you to play them out. And as you're playing them out, you feel whether or not you're comfortable with what you're playing out. And that feeling is the compass toward your values, right? You're like, oh, do I want this? Or you could be excited about it. And you're like, oh, why am I excited about that? And so I do think there needs to be this balance between making sure you stand for what you stand for and being flexible about what technology you use to get there. And then sometimes, you switch the values a little bit because you're like, well, I now that I have more information, I see this differently. But like those should kind of switch at a slower pace than your ability to like try new solutions. The needs are really core. The solutions should be very flexible.
Should we get into maybe a couple more, like you mentioned at the beginning, some of the more practical ways to get to some of these solutions, whether they're tools or methodologies? I think we have, the understanding chaos is here. We're all experiencing it.
Yeah.
It's too much for all of us. Like, what are some practical ways that we can navigate through this, and help design a better future, if you will?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the meta one, the big one, is to really when you're versed in design, you kind of this is something you just hear over and over when you're educated, but that it's really the constraints that are the key to doing the work. So when you accept the constraints or the limits of the situation that you're in, that's where the new ideas come from. And it seems like counterintuitive because you think of creativity as like novelty, transcendence. How do we come up with something new? But actually, like creativity has two aspects. One is that it's novel or new, and the other one that it has utility and it's useful. And what you're trying to do is basically like figure out what constraints you're really facing. And that's where the solution will kind of tie those together. And that's where the utility comes from. So, I don't know if I design furniture as an example, when we go into a situation, we're making in the end are tables, chairs, couches, whiteboards, like it's all the same stuff. But you really have to go in and say like, well, what is this community trying to do? Like if this, is this, we often are working in creative educational spaces. So like, is this about a place where students can show their work, or is this about a place where people can come together and learn from each other? Is this about a place that needs to be flexible so that, if we're doing X, Y, or Z, the space can adapt to that? And those all, in a sense, when you design them, they feel similar because they might have a similar look. They're all these creative spaces, but they're very, very different constraints. Like if the constraint is we need it to be flexible so that people can choose what they want, versus the constraint is, we want a place where people can make things and display their work. They're just light years apart. It's still tables and chairs in the end, but what you're dealing with is totally different. So the ability to identify the things that matter, I think is one of the key skills. And it's actually really hard to do because I think people focus on the solution rather than digging into the constraints and the needs. So it might be like, oh, ChatGPT, how am I going to use it in the classroom? Versus what is my class about? What am I trying to teach? How could would this tool be helpful and effective in me being able to teach that? So like if your goal, say, is to help students be able to make sense. Let's say you're an English teacher or something, and your goal is to help students be able to make sense of the world, be critical thinkers. Well, there's lots of ways ChatGPT can help with that, right? And then there's a lot of ways it could harm it, right? So you have to create, it might be like, oh, well, if they use it, they're not thinking for themselves. Or, they could sort of quiz it and then try to see like, how do they know, whether this answer it gave is better than that answer? And how do they be discerning about that? Or how do they understand what it's putting back and where that came from and what's missing from it? You could use it as a critical thinking tool all you want, or it could totally break down critical thinking completely,
Yeah, I guess the power is in the user and the way that they think about using it properly.
Yeah.
I've given a couple presentations to companies explaining them like, use this. One, if you don't use it, you're going to get left behind, which I think is kind of a thing that everybody talks about. But if you don't use it well, then you're essentially setting yourself up to become dependent on it or over dependent on it, and then your own personal skills that you've worked so hard and so many years to develop are going to dwindle.
Mhm.
If you don't take, I guess, these ideas into consideration before, and this is just ChatGPT, we're not even talking about all the other kind of emerging technologies that are coming out. You're not going to be ready for the future, if you will. The future will come to you and kind of take over aspects of your life.
Yeah, and I think there are a couple things in that too. One is that it is really the how we use these things is the place where we have the most agency. Like, I don't know. I kind of feel I'm not like a technological determinist, like everything just kind of works on human brains and we're just mindless beings that respond to the technology. I don't think that's right. But I don't know if there's any stopping generative AI from just, going everywhere. However, like how we choose to use it, what regulation we put on it, individually, how we interact with it. I mean, everyone's starting to have different relationships with social media now. Some people are, check the feed every morning. Other people only do it once a week. Other people ignore it altogether. That's where we have agency, and it makes a very big difference, in how you live. The other thing too, being able to not forget your own value, I think is so critical. So you talked about your travels, right, between, undergrad and grad
Mhm.
school. Like, I mean, I don't even have to maybe you can contradict me here, but, like, how much of those things that you learned traveling factor into your grad school or factor into what you're doing right now, you know?
I mean, I would honestly, well, maybe not like specifically technically skill wise, but I think that
Right.
the learnings, the lessons that I got while traveling are valuable for a lifetime, whereas the grad school was like valuable for my first job. And then,
Yeah.
that might have been it.
Yeah, and these are the things where, like, we know that day-to-day work, unless you get a very specific position, doesn't totally map to the degree, right? Like, like probably the first couple jobs it does, but then once you start leading people, unless say you went to management school or something like that, it doesn't necessarily track, right? So all these things are so important, and they're all part of your ability to do things in the world and your value in the world.
Mhm.
And I think a worry for me is that we get so focused on the technology that we forget what we're bringing to the table.
Hmm.
Even that narrative of being left behind, which I agree with, frankly, it's a little bit, I worry a little bit that that sends a message of like, if we don't keep up, we're not valuable. There's truth to it.
Yeah, no, not valuable. I would just say like not competitive. But I'm thinking
Yeah.
maybe more of a
No,
business mindset. Yeah.
yeah. No, and I think it's true because like it can be such a big advantage. I mean,
Mm.
you could say that about like being able to use a laptop, right? Like it's such a big advantage. It's such a big advantage. There's a certain point where you kind of have to opt in, or you're like really opting out.
Mhm, mhm, mm.
But at the same time, I just want to make sure we don't forget that, like, well, the way we learn things, all the life experience that we have, it'll affect the decisions we make about using the thing and how we interpret the thing. And that makes a ton of difference. Two people using the same tool for the same job in different ways leads to hugely different outcomes. I could go into like details about that, but like it really is, the how is really important here. And we have a lot of agency individually and collectively on the how.
Well, do you mind going into that? I mean, our time's dwindling down here a little bit, but if
Yeah.
you've got like a use case or practical example or something like that, um, please, by all means.
Yeah, I mean, just think of like the simplest tool you can, like a spreadsheet or like a project management tool or whatever it might be. So we use a tool called Asana, right? And different people use it in different ways as a project management tool. Uh, some people I've seen will use it to the nth degree. They use it for every single thing it can possibly do. Like they've become experts in the tool, right? Other people I've seen, they use it for what they need it for. Like it's like, yeah, I'll use it because I want to be able to have like a collective calendar and I want to be able to have tasks that everybody can see, but I'm not really going to like use all the features. Now, I'm not saying one is better than the other, but
Mhm.
they're extremely different approaches. And there is a huge cost in the I'm going to use it for everything it can do because you don't need everything it can do more often than not. So if you're spending a lot of time making sure the tool can do everything it can do, you might be wasting a lot of time in terms of what's actually valuable for you to put out. Now, if you don't use the tool for everything, you can get it to do, you might like be leaving some stuff on the table. So, and that might not be as efficient, but figuring out like where you want to be in that threshold, again, with generative AI, we've been using it as a tool to quiz our students rather than the other way around. So we put generative AI in the position of asking the questions rather than answering them. And I'm not saying it's not better or worse, but for us, it's like, wow, this allows us to, I work with a woman named Leticia Britos Cavagnaro, and she's created a layer on top of, I think, Claude to create a bot called Riff. And Riff is a reflection bot that helps you digest and think about what you did. So all it is like it's watching you, it's asking you questions, more like a therapist. It's not really like therapy, but that kind of model where it's like hearing what you're saying, asking you back in a thoughtful way to try to get you to go one direction or another. So it's really about like how can we use the tool to help our students better intake the information rather than I'm going to use it as a research tool, which is also fine to use, right? But they're very different ways of doing it, and they have very, very different outcomes.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah.
Um, so taking, I mean, everything that we've talked about today, considering the exponential future that we're moving into. I mean, we're in it now, but it's only going to get worse or better depending on your
Yeah,
perspective.
seems like it.
This concept of designing the future, realizing breaking points, understanding constraints, and enables innovation and creativity. Bit of a weird question here to kind of maybe summarize all this or end the conversation. But like, what are you most excited about for the future with these
Mhm.
things in mind? Is it
Yeah.
the emerging technology? Is it helping people understand how to design the future to kind of make a better world? Like, what are you thinking of?
Yeah. So I don't know. This is an interesting way to put it because it's going to sound a little hopeful, but not necessarily confident.
Okay.
Um, which is to say that like I think I'm hopeful that we might get it a little more right this time, right? Like, if you look at the history of the tools that we've created for productivity,
Hmm.
they give us more productivity, but they don't give us more free time, almost always, right?
Really good point. Yes.
Yeah, and I think that's a big problem. I'm a person who's very caught up in that, so I'm not pointing fingers here. I have no free time. I'm working all the time. I've basically got, sort of 3 different things going on at once right at this moment. I haven't had a day off in probably a month. So I'm not saying it's working yet. But, could we use these things to actually make things fundamentally better in the ways that we want?
Mm.
I think the potency of the technology has a possibility of doing that. And then really the question, so that's the hope. The sort of like lack of confidence about it is like, have we shown in the past that we've been able to pull that off?
Right.
Is there evidence that we're going to be able to do that this time that when we could do it last time? I'm not sure, but I do think if we focus on that how of it, how are we using this stuff? Really dig into that, each as an individual and in our organizations. I think we have a good chance.
I really, really like that answer. I did history as part of my undergrad way back when now. And, like, okay, this isn't the history that I studied, but, thinking about the history of technology, like, wasn't the dream and vision of like the dishwasher to like free up labor so that, your what was it? A stay-at-home mother would be able to go out with her friends and go to the gym, like do the things that would be productive for herself. And all of these things kind of just enabled, especially women just to work more, right? You don't need to be at home as much. You can just work and work and work. So, as somebody who started a business just a little bit over a year ago, and, also days off are either non-existent or very, very few and far between. You do get caught up in this, and it is exciting. We
Yeah.
are in a very exciting time. So there is this, I don't know, high vibrational state, or whatever term you want. It is. That's exactly. But maybe, to take a step back and to think like, okay, are all of these tools, are all of these emerging technologies actually benefiting life and giving us maybe what we truly want as human beings? Is this what we are as human beings? Is this what the function actually is? And maybe we are okay with this state. I think it brings up a lot of questions. Very interesting. Thank you for that answer, Scott.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I've really enjoyed it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I see your time is over here.
Your call if you want to.
Yeah. I have other things. The business area, there's always other things.
So we need some time off too.
Yeah. I mean, I think we could easily go on for another hour. Thank you very much for coming on. It's I think some really interesting ideas, and as I said before we recorded, I thought, it would be unique or different and maybe a little bit refreshing as well. Obviously, we need to talk about AI and Gen AI, but, from a different perspective, I think is very valuable. So thanks for coming on. I have your book. I do promise to read it fully. And I think that many other people that think about the future in, hopefully the way that this podcast brings to you, that, they should also check out your book as well. Speaking of which, website, LinkedIn, where should people reach out and follow what you're up to?
Yeah, you can find my co-author and I on LinkedIn. I'm Scott Doorley, and she's Carissa Carter, and I'm pretty sure we're the only ones of those on there. And then in terms of picking up the books, we've actually been publishing a series of 12 books through the D.school, and we have a website where we have all those books, which is dschool.stanford.edu/books.
Perfect. I'll have those up on the show notes. Scott, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast. It was a real pleasure. I wish you all the best of luck with the book and the 3 main things that you're up to. I'm sure you're just as busy as all of us. So thanks for coming on.
You too. Good luck with everything, Mark.
Yeah. Take care.
Thanks. All right.
Well, thanks for listening to this week's Future Tech and Foresight podcast. If you like what you've heard here, there are, of course, a number of ways that you can support the podcast. The best way would be to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or give a rating on Spotify, which you can find a step-by-step explanation for on the futuretechandforesight.com website. Alternatively, feel free to leave a comment either on the episode show notes or the YouTube channel where you can see video recordings of the interviews. And finally, if you are part of an organization that is aware of the disruptive and transformational impact that emerging and future technologies will bring and want to know more, please get in touch to hear about the strategic foresight services that we offer and how we can help future-proof your organization and take advantage of the phenomenal opportunities available to survive and thrive in the future.
A lot of future-shocked people and future-shocked institutions in our society are simply overwhelmed.
Once there is superintelligence, the fate of humanity may depend on what the superintelligence does.
Science fact is catching up to science fiction.
The first truly intelligent machine will be the last invention that humanity needs to make.
The only scarcity that will exist in the future is that which we decide to create ourselves as humans.
Within a 10-year design revolution, we can have all humanity living the highest standard living anybody's ever known.
Progress is accelerating at an exponential pace, and it's going to reach a point where progress is so fast it's going to be a singularity.
We are probably one of the last generations of Homo sapiens.
Every single headline points to the birth pangs of a Type 1 civilization.